Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe and like. And please visit us at barrykibrick.com, where you'll see all the ways that you can become a patron of our mission and help us continue to build a community of seekers who quest for knowledge, information, and most importantly, wisdom. We all know that our world is rapidly changing in every level of our society. But what the future holds will be determined by our actions today. Hi, I'm Barry Kibrick, and my guest, Dr. Pippa Malmgren, is an expert who meets these challenges head-on every day. A former White House advisor and now advisor to the British government, she knows from the inside out what we must do to navigate our modern challenges. In her book, The Leadership Lab, with her co-author Chris Lewis, the doctor explains what we must do to make a difference and build an empathic, stable, and strong future.
Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick is made possible in part by Patreon. Patreon helps creators build and run membership businesses, from podcasters to writers, musicians, artists, and more, with tools that allow their fans to become patrons. More information is available at patreon.com.
Dr. Pippa, it is a pleasure having you. After reading this book, I am so grateful that you've graced our set. Welcome to Between the Lines.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic.
My pleasure. This book is really written so that we understand what we have to do to reevaluate modern leadership. But I really believe that we are all leaders to a certain extent, and we all have to reevaluate what we're doing personally so that our leadership, quote, actually gets the message. So we really, especially in a democracy, we're in charge of our leaders, and if they're not doing the right job, we must.
Yeah, and when I was writing this book with Chris Lewis, my co-author, that's very much how we were thinking. It's partly addressed to the leaders of today who are definitely in crisis. We see crisis in almost every category of leadership: political leadership, business leadership, religious community leadership. Every category we see real crisis. But in the end, yeah, we decided it's really about every individual taking responsibility and thinking through what is the part they're going to play in a modern democracy? What's the vision of a society you want to have? We all have a voice in that.
You say that the big shift comes from the fact that for so many years we did this reductionist thinking, the sort of, would that be the right brain or the left brain? What is the reductionist? I don't even remember, but it doesn't matter. We did one of on the right brain, the reductionist, and we really need to go to what you call the parenthetic, which is, as you described, a looking across. So it's not so much just a space and numbers that we've kept using. We need to look across the landscape of humanity.
Yeah, you look, the whole education system and the way the media looks at things, everybody is all focused on numbers and data and analytical analysis. But the problem is the analytical doesn't answer the question. You also have to add the parenthetical, which means the ability to look across. So drill down into the data, but the problem is data's backward looking. It doesn't tell you about tomorrow. And it's not always linear. Sometimes life is cyclical. So data's fine. You can drill into it if you like, but you also have to look across, connect the dots between the silos, consider the landscape. Maybe the best way to put it is one thing is about math, the other is about mood, and both matter.
And not only do they matter, you give a great example when you talk about the way they even mark how there's inflation, and they'll say, well, it's only 2.2%. Yet when in your book, as you read it, and by the way, you just talk to anybody you know, and everyone says, there's no I go to that gas station and I'm paying dollars more than I did just months ago. Or you go to your doctor and you see the new medical prices, and you see colleges that, I remember the state colleges you could afford to go to. You can't even afford to go to state colleges anymore. So that 2.2% number, that's the drill down number that they have from the past, but without looking across at the people, they're not really getting it, are they?
No, and this is such a crucial point. My last book was called Signals, and it was about signals that are not the data. And it was this point exactly. So the data point we call inflation, it's technically called the CPI. It's a data point that reflects an average. Now, some people will feel higher prices for rent, higher prices for groceries, higher prices for healthcare bills much sooner and faster than some others who may never feel them at all. They may never notice. So the real question is, who is hit first and hardest? And what is their human response to that phenomena? And I would argue really strongly, populism has its roots in this phenomena where the officials all say, but the data point says only 2.2. But everybody's down at the bar going, this is incredible how much a glass of wine costs. And you can see it in something I call shrinkflation, which is when you pay the same price, but the size of what you're buying keeps getting smaller. And it doesn't matter whether it's you go to a restaurant and the steak is smaller, or toilet paper rolls these days have less paper on them. There's less fluid in any kind of jar that you buy. And this is all indicative of more inflation pressures, and there's a human cost with that. What I think is the problem is the elevator doors are broken. And what I mean by that is, after the financial crisis, we said to all the people who were at the top, and of which I was one, I worked in the financial markets, these people made a really big mistake and lost a lot of money, and the loss has been thrown onto society, and everybody has to pay for it for a long time. What was the response by the government to that? A blank check. Basically the bailout was bigger than a wartime budget. So the people at the top in capitalism normally they're supposed to come down the elevator when they fail, right? They say that, capitalism without failure is like Catholicism without sin, right? The game doesn't work unless there's failure. And similarly, people who are at the bottom, who can't get into college because they can't afford to pay for it, those folks, how do they go up the elevator? And when I talk to chief executives, political leaders all over the world, and I ask them, when they say, I'm so worried about populism, and they say, I want to do something about it, I say, okay, when's the last time you hired someone who didn't have a college degree, who maybe was displaced, who didn't have a traditional path? And they say, never. And I'm like, okay, you close the elevator doors, they can't go up. No wonder they're trying to break the system. It's not working for them.
Oh, and you say, in fact, that the biggest problems that our leaders don't have, by them not looking across at that particular situation, which you say is their need for situational fluency, so that they can be understanding the situations that are really going on and not just be in their, as you call, echo chambers and silos.
Totally. So it's a fascinating human phenomena, but the higher you go and the busier you are, the less time you have to assess what's actually going on. And often you're surrounded by fewer and fewer people that you've known forever longer, who maybe are equally disconnected from what's really going on. So what you end up saying is stuff that indicates you're operating on a snapshot that's out of date. Like a lot of leaders will say, China is the future because all the jobs are going to China. And I say, but as an economist, I can see that Mexico is more competitive than China. Its wages are 20 to 40% cheaper. The Chinese are investing in Mexico like crazy. Just look at the new airport they're building. And so actually, it's going to sound strange. We're here in LA, but I grew up surfing. It's like surfing. You literally have to understand, it's not a snapshot. It's a permanently fluid situation you have to keep checking all the time. So the reality is that actually, the U.S. is very competitive now versus China, where it wasn't 10 years ago. But if you're making public policy on the assumption that it is not competitive, you're out of date.
But also, as you said about the mood, the people don't feel that we're competitive. That's where it really lies in. That's where I say the danger really is that if we're not feeling this, it doesn't matter. And by the way, I don't want things to be based just on feelings. That would be inappropriate. As you say, you need not more of one or more of the other. You need to bring them together.
So here's an example. I have a friend who's the chief executive of one of the largest auto parts companies in America. And she said her biggest problem was hiring talent. And she decided to start hiring 18-year-olds instead of only college graduates. And she would build their skills and pay for their college, pay for their graduate school. Guess who the biggest opponents were? The parents and the teachers, because their vision of manufacturing was stuck in the Victorian era. So she had to hire a bus to bring the parents and the teachers and the students all to the factory, which of course is like a surgical lab. It's so pristine, to show them what modern manufacturing looks like. So it's kind of jumping back to a 1950s model where IBM trains you. That's happening, that's real. But is that the narrative? Is that the story? No, the story is all the jobs are going to China. So we have to be very careful about how we tell our stories and that they're accurate.
But you also say that the way to get there is that if the people telling the stories, and this goes from the media to the leaders, if they have virtues, if they have, in fact, you even say spiritual virtues, you go that far as saying, if we do not, and they do not, have this sort of basic of a culture that we know is the way to do things, what's going to happen?
So a simple way of thinking about this is 20th century leadership was all about the leader, right? The Jack Welch era, the cult of the iconic leader. We're arguing 21st century leadership is all about the ship. If you're a leader, your goal, your purpose, your job is not about your self-aggrandizement. It's about how to get the ship to work together, how to pull the best talent out of the people that are part of your organization, whether it's in politics or religion or community or business, it doesn't matter. The point is the ship approach is now what we need, and this is exactly what we were trying to explain in this book.
And that's why you say leadership used to be thought of as a science, but it's really an art.
Definitely, absolutely. So, for example, a lot of leaders have to-do lists, right? We all have to-do lists. But what they really need is a to-be list. Because if you're going to exemplify values, which is the only way that people feel they can trust what you stand for, you can't do values. You have to be them. And that's why these crises that we're seeing in leadership, for example, the lying about the emissions controls from the automotive industry, the sex scandals that we're seeing in the Catholic Church, the scandals around companies not paying all their taxes, all these things create a much more fundamental crisis of trust in institutions, in society, because at the core, the question is, what are the values? So again, 20th century leaders were all about the letter of the law. 21st century leaders, it's got to be adherence to the spirit of the law.
But again, with all this information now comes another problem. We have tremendous amount of information, but we are not necessarily getting the true information. So much is misleading or purposely, as you even say in the book, media is a business and they're there to make money, so no matter what they want to report, they're going to report. But the point is, we are overloaded with information and we are lacking a lot of knowledge and wisdom.
So the information overload is a crucial component of what we talk about in the book, because leaders need to understand why everybody is so angry, why there's so much impatience. And it really has to do with modern technology. We are so much more connected electronically with so much less conversation. There's this amazing interconnectedness of human beings, and at the same time, this sense of atomization. People feel alienated, not connected. And we can see this in the numbers of adults who are living together, sharing a roof because they can't afford to pay for that roof by themselves, but not in partnered relationships. And in fact, younger people, particularly young men, not being in a partnered relationship or having any kind of a love interest until they're much older, into their mid-20s. And if leaders don't understand this is what's happening in society, it's very hard to be a leader in that environment.
Well, you say the first task of enlightened leadership is cultivated doubt. So what's happening is as you said, confidence is not I forgot the exact way you put it, confidence is not an excuse for competence. Am I correct?
Actually, what I said was, we confuse confidence and competence.
Exactly. And until the leaders themselves, and again, it's up to us to make this happen, till they see the doubt themselves, they're never going to change.
So here's the first thing. We got to move our leaders away from prediction and towards preparedness. Now, prediction is what happens when they say, Trump will never win. And how many times did we hear people say that? Or, I live in the UK. Brexit will never happen. This is prediction, and it's binary, and it's a mug's game. What makes sense is saying, we have no idea what's going to happen. So let's consider a huge array of possibilities. Let's open our minds to all kinds of scenarios, because testing ourselves against that wide array of possible outcomes is going to make us a lot more robust and agile and able to deal with stuff. The reason our leaders are blindsided is because they're all into the cult of the infallible leader, and I am predicting, and I say, President Trump will never win. Okay, now we have a mess because you weren't prepared. So in the book, we're very focused on how to move people away from prediction to preparedness, and that's rooted in certainty. The moment a leader says, I am certain, they are immediately grounded in mediocrity. You cannot be anything but mediocre if you're certain.
Now, the other thing that you say we're missing is patience. In fact, impatience is one of the biggest blocks we have. We no longer have that time. I think you used the quote by Einstein to just be creative by doing nothing. We are so impatient, we're running around like chickens without our heads, and I've seen this over and over in organizations that I'm associated with. I'm going, what's the rush here? Why do you need this tomorrow? Why are you not thinking through this? Why? And no one is. They're just acting and reacting.
Yeah, well, again, the speed electronics are giving us. We can choose a partner by swiping right or swiping left. People get enraged if they can't get to their website within 2 seconds. Anything over 2 seconds, they shift to something else. So this is a very interesting phenomena we have to really think about. Chris's last book was called Too Fast to Think, a fantastic bestseller, where he interviewed a bunch of highly creative people and found out the best solutions, the best answers are epiphanies in life. They come when we are not at work, when we are not working, and when we're not trying. But what do we do when we have a big problem? And let's face it, we got a lot of problems in society today. We hold more meetings, we stay in the office longer, we work harder. No, stop, turn it off, do something else, and it will come to you.
Now, this I was not expecting to find in the book, but you say the role of humor. And in fact, because I had the British version, and I'm looking, who spells humor this way? But
the British do.
Right, it was.
I lived in England too
Am I right? And I looked at it and I said, and that started me laughing. But we forget that that's an important role. What happens is, what we're basically taking out are the human elements, and what you're basically saying is bring them back in.
Absolutely. And we have to preserve these parts of human beings because that's where innovation comes from. And humor is such a crucial part of innovation. If you look at so many of the most amazing discoveries in history, they almost always happen when somebody started to laugh at a situation. This also comes to a really core concept, which we call the Church of Fail, which is we have to worship the failures because that's where the learning comes from. We can't condemn people for trying and failing. We have to encourage people to try and fail, and like Emerson says, try and fail faster, because that's where we get progress and innovation. Back to leadership. Leadership isn't just about the political leader at the top or the CEO. I run a robotics company. Every time I try to innovate and do something new, making commercial drones, I'm expressing leadership because I don't put legs on my drones. I put wheels on my drones because they won't break as easily. And everyone goes, that's crazy, we've never seen this before. This is my way of expressing leadership, to try to change how the industry works.
But as that leader, if you're going to encourage the failure and the mistakes, you have to have a certain humility. And that's been also a problem with the older fashioned type of leadership. It was, again, where we went overconfidence and not humility. And the humility, even the great leaders, that is what they have, humility.
Yes, and this is why it's so important to stop confusing confidence with competence. They are two totally different things. When we hold meetings, how often is it that whoever talks first, loudest, and longest wins the point? We can change that. When we talk a lot about tools you can use to change this, you can say equal time. Everybody's going to get 5 minutes. Suddenly the quieter, more reflective voices, not so arrogant, more humble, get airtime. So we need to do this, and that's a particular issue, by the way, with women, and we do talk a lot about gender in the book, because the core thing we're arguing for is more diversity of thinking. Now, more diversity of people helps that, and we're not into diversity of people because it's nice, though it is. It's because it's efficient. It's because it gets better outcomes. You get better profitability, better performance, more trust. And so if you want diversity of thinking, you have to make space for voices that are not overconfident.
Well, you know something, in fact, one of the things we do on this show is we have a little element called afterwards. And I'm going to save that whole gender talk for our online, because you approach it very differently. And I want to you really approach it very differently, and I want to save that. That's going to be for our what we call our afterwards features, which is always online immediately after the show airs, so people can see it right away. But right before we go there, actually, you know what? That does bring, though, in one of the things that you say is the core motto, and that's the motto of the U.S. itself, E pluribus unum. Out of many comes one. That goes back to that diversity, but it's got to be careful. It's not just diversity for diversity's sake. As you said, that's still nice. It has to be diversity for the thought process. That's where it really lies. If you're picking people of any color, of any gender, of any race, of any ethnicity, and they're all still thinking like you do not have diversity.
Yeah, and so this is such an interesting point, because both Chris and I hear a lot of Americans, a lot of Brits, people around the world, they'll say, my society is divided, we're all arguing all the time, and this is very bad. We say, well, you know, actually, there are lots of societies where you're not allowed to argue, where you're not allowed to have a dissenting opinion. We look at the Chinese social credit system that they've introduced, where they actually create a score for every human being based on their level of social compliance. And if you don't comply, if you Google stuff you shouldn't Google, then they lock you down into digital prisons. You can't take a train, you can't take a plane. If you really want a strong society and you believe in democracy, creating an environment where divisions of opinion can happen is important. The question is, what's the tone that we use? And that's why, we live in a world right now where people are very much like, if you don't agree with me, you're either an idiot or evil. Okay, now we cannot have civil society and a civil dialogue.
Oh, I have to say something. I don't mean to interrupt, but you have one of the great lines in the book is simply this. You say, people now are more concerned with their children marrying out of their political party than they are out of their religion or any other ethnic thing. And that when I read that, I shared it with my wife, and we both just started laughing because we see how true that really is.
Yeah, so tolerance. And just because you tolerate other opinions doesn't mean that you share them, but it's very important, and it's important in a bigger way, which is to get out of your own clique, your own network, your own bubble. I was recently speaking at the Google Zeitgeist conference, and Senator Clinton's former advisor on communications was there. And we were talking about how did they miss what had happened, the sea change in American politics. And it really came down to they just weren't talking to anybody outside their circle. Well, this is a problem for all of us. We all need to get outside of our circle, outside of our comfort zone, go learn new skills that are in areas that we've never been involved with before, go meet people that are totally different from ourselves, because that generates tolerance.
Which is why you say learning and leading must go hand in hand. Thank you, Doctor, so much for helping us learn about leading.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure, and thank you for joining us. Remember, as I discussed before, immediately following this episode, you can catch our Afterwards feature online by visiting barrykibrick.com. This time, Dr. Pippa and I will discuss the role of gender in leadership. And as I said, it's going to be a very different discussion than you might be expecting. But before we do, I'd like to leave you with these few more words from the Leadership Lab. The promise of the future is exciting and inspirational. If we get it right, we're looking at an infinitely more sustainable, fairer, productive, efficient world with greater access to education and information. A world that is healthier, better led, more optimistic, and inclusive. I'm Barry Kibrick. The difference between a promising future and one we may not appreciate is all up to us. So be excited and inspirational, and we will live in a healthier world that is more optimistic and inclusive. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you.
Now,
To become part of the Between the Lines family, go to barrykibrick.com. There you can join our book club, participate in Q&As, catch past episodes, listen to Barry's podcasts, read his blog, and experience exclusive online features, all at barrykibrick.com. Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick is made possible in part by Patreon. Patreon helps creators build and run membership businesses, from podcasters to writers, musicians, artists, and more, with tools that allow their fans to become patrons. More information is available at patreon.com.